All right, so today we're diving into a book that I think a lot of you have probably heard of. It's called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck by Mark Manson. Now, I know the title might sound a little bit, well, intense, but trust me, this book is anything but a guide to apathy. It's more about kind of a mindful approach to figuring out what really deserves your energy and your attention.
Right.
Have you ever felt like you're pulled in a million different directions, stressed about things that, in the grand scheme of things, don't really matter?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's kind of where this book comes in.
And what I think is so interesting about this book is how Manson really kind of turns the traditional self-help approach on its head. He doesn't sugarcoat things. And he kicks things off with this really intriguing story about Charles Bukowski, who was a writer known for his, let's say, gritty outlook on life. But despite his unconventional choices, he actually found success as a writer. And get this, his tombstone reads, "Don't try." Almost like a challenge to conventional wisdom.
Yeah, that definitely makes you stop and think. So how does this tie into the whole not giving a feck idea?
Well, think about it this way. We're constantly bombarded with all of these messages telling us to strive for more, to be better, to care about everything. But Manson argues that this constant pressure to achieve and be happy all the time can actually backfire. He says that we have a limited amount of fecks to give, and so we need to be really careful about where we invest them.
So it's not about being indifferent to everything. It's about being selective with your energy and your attention.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that not all problems are created equal. Manson introduces this concept that he calls the feedback loop from hell. Imagine you're stressing about something, like having a cooler vacation than your coworkers. That stress leads to these negative feelings, which makes you stress even more about the vacation, and so on. It's like chasing a house that keeps moving farther away the closer you get.
Oh, I think we've all been caught in that loop at some point, haven't we? Like where you try so hard to force happiness or success that it just becomes more elusive.
Absolutely. And that's where Manson's disappointment panda comes in. I know it sounds a little silly, but it's actually a really brilliant metaphor for accepting these difficult truths about life.
Okay, so I have to admit, I'm picturing a panda wearing a tiny suit, delivering harsh truths with just like a deadpan expression. It's kind of funny, actually.
Exactly. It's meant to be humorous, but it's also very thought-provoking. The disappointment panda represents the idea that, we need to accept that life isn't always rainbows and butterflies. There will be challenges, there will be setbacks, and yes, there will be disappointments.
So it's not about avoiding those negative experiences, but about learning how to deal with them constructively.
Right. Manson argues that true happiness comes from solving problems, not pretending that they don't exist. He tells this great story about a prince who's never actually experienced any hardship. And the prince thinks that to reach enlightenment, he needs to suffer. So he runs away and lives as a beggar. But guess what? Suffering just sucks.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would argue with that.
The point is, it's not about seeking out suffering. It's about finding good problems to solve, problems that are meaningful to you. And that's where defining your values comes in.
So how does Manson suggest we go about figuring out what those values are?
He emphasizes the importance of aligning your struggles with your values. He uses his own experience as an example. He had this dream of becoming a rock star. But when he actually started doing the practicing for hours, dealing with rejection, hauling gear around, he realized he didn't actually love the process. He loved the idea of being a musician, but not the reality of it.
Yeah, that's so relatable. I think a lot of us get caught up in the fantasy of a goal without really considering what it actually takes to get there.
Exactly. And that leads to another key takeaway: taking responsibility. Manson is all about owning your choices and their consequences. He even talks about a very personal experience of being cheated on. Devastating, yes, but he realized that holding on to blame wasn't going to help him move forward.
So it's about recognizing that even when bad things happen, we still have the power to choose how we respond to them.
Precisely. Taking responsibility isn't about blaming yourself. It's about acknowledging your role in a situation and using that knowledge to make positive changes. And this leads us to another really interesting point that Manson makes about the dangers of the self-esteem movement. He argues that this constant focus on feeling good about ourselves can actually lead to entitlement and a lack of genuine self-worth.
Oh, so you mean like those people who are always bragging about how great they are, but their actions don't really back it up?
Exactly. He uses this example of Jimmy, who's this delusional startup founder who is all about self-promotion. But he has no substance to back it up. His life is falling apart. But he's still convinced he's amazing.
So it's like a false sense of confidence, not really based on actual achievements or growth.
Right? True self-worth.
Yeah.
according to Manson, comes from honestly facing our weaknesses, not inflating our egos. It's about being willing to acknowledge where we need to improve, and then actually putting in the work to grow.
That makes a lot of sense. I think it's easy to get caught up in comparing ourselves to others,
Mhm.
especially with social media constantly showcasing everyone's highlight reel.
That's a great point.
Well,
And it leads us to what Manson calls the tyranny of exceptionalism. Think about it. We're constantly bombarded with stories of extraordinary people achieving incredible things, which can make us feel like we're not good enough if we're not constantly crushing it.
yeah, it's like everyone's trying to be special all the time, which ironically makes it harder to actually stand out.
Exactly. Manson argues that most of us are average at most things, and that's okay. Accepting that reality can actually be quite freeing. He uses this really fascinating story about Hiru Noda, a Japanese soldier who continued fighting World War II for 29 years after it ended.
Wait, what? How is that even possible?
Well, he was hiding in the jungle, convinced that the war was still going on. It's a powerful example of how clinging to a false reality, even when the evidence contradicts it, can lead to isolation and struggle.
Wow, that's a pretty extreme example. But I see how it connects to the idea of letting go of these unrealistic expectations. In a world obsessed with being special, maybe accepting our averageness is the truly rebellious act.
I think Manson would agree with you there. Now, all this talk about not giving effect might make you wonder about the importance of relationships and setting boundaries.
Right, because it sounds like it could be really easily misinterpreted
Yeah,
as being selfish or inconsiderate of others.
that's a valid concern, but Manson actually dedicates a whole chapter to the power of saying no and setting healthy boundaries in relationships.
Okay, so how does that tie into the overall message of the book?
Well, Manson uses this really unexpected example, Romeo and Juliet. Now, we usually think of that story as this grand romance, but he argues that it's actually a cautionary tale of what happens when people have terrible boundaries.
It's an interesting take.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess their love is pretty all-consuming
Mm.
and ultimately leads to tragedy.
Exactly. He points out that healthy relationships require clear boundaries. It's about knowing where your responsibility ends and your partner's begins, and not getting so entangled that you lose your own sense of self.
So saying no is actually a way of protecting yourself and the relationship in the long run.
Precisely. It's about learning to say no to bad relationships, unhealthy opportunities, and even beliefs that no longer serve you. This might seem counterintuitive, but Manson believes that embracing rejection can be incredibly liberating.
Okay, so we've talked about choosing our battles, accepting our limitations, taking responsibility, and setting boundaries. But what about commitment? Doesn't that seem like kind of the opposite of not giving a fuck?
That's where things get really interesting. Manson argues that commitment, rather than limiting us, actually brings a profound sense of freedom.
I can see how that might be true. If you're constantly chasing new experiences, you never really get the chance to go deep with anything.
That's exactly what Manson experienced. He was a self-proclaimed commitment phobe for years, bouncing from country to country, job to job, relationship to relationship.
So it's kind of exciting, actually.
It was at first, but he eventually realized that all of this novelty was preventing him from experiencing the rewards that come with depth and mastery. So he made a conscious decision to commit to his writing, to one woman, to a few close friends.
And how did that shift change things for him?
He found that by simplifying his life and focusing on what truly mattered, he was able to achieve a level of fulfillment and success that had eluded him before. He was no longer scattered and distracted, constantly seeking the next shiny object. Instead, he was able to go deep, to hone his craft, to build strong and lasting connections.
So in a way, commitment isn't about restriction. It's about creating space for the things that truly matter to flourish.
Precisely. It's about making conscious choices and then investing in those choices wholeheartedly. And that leads us to what I think is the most powerful and thought-provoking part of the book, Manson's exploration of death.
Okay, I have to admit, thinking about death isn't exactly my idea of a good time. But I'm curious to hear how he approaches it.
He's not talking about it in a morbid or depressing way. Instead, he uses it as a lens through which to examine what's truly important in life.
So it's more about using the awareness of our own mortality to clarify our values and priorities.
Exactly. He shares this very personal story about losing his friend Josh. It's a poignant reminder that life is fragile and unpredictable, and our time here is precious.
Yeah, I can see how facing that reality would make you reevaluate what you're spending your time and energy on.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the question of legacy. What kind of impact do we want to leave on the world? What will people remember us for?
That's a big question. It can feel a bit overwhelming, to be honest.
It is a big question, but it's also incredibly empowering. It reminds us that we have the power to shape our own lives, to create something meaningful, to make a difference, even in small ways.
So it's not necessarily about achieving some grand feat
Mm,
or becoming famous. It's about living in alignment with our values and contributing to the world in a way that feels authentic to us.
exactly. And it's important to remember that our legacy doesn't have to be some grand, world-changing thing. It can be as simple as, being a kind and supportive friend, a loving partner, a compassionate human being.
So it's more about those everyday acts of goodness that ripple outwards and create a positive impact on the people around us.
Absolutely. It all comes back to the idea of choosing what you truly give a fuck about, and then letting go of the rest. Which, funny enough, brings us back to Bukowski's tombstone. Don't try.
Okay, so we've come full circle. But I have to admit that epitaph still throws me off a bit. Is he suggesting that we should just give up on our dreams and ambitions?
I think it's a little more nuanced than that. Maybe it's not about giving up, but about letting go of the need to constantly strive for perfection or to prove ourselves to the world. It's about accepting ourselves, flaws and all, and then focusing on living a life that feels authentic and meaningful to us, even if it doesn't look exactly like what society might deem successful.
So it's more about defining success on our own terms, based on our own values,
Yeah.
rather than chasing some external standard that might not even resonate with us.
Exactly. And that's a really powerful message, especially in a world that often feels obsessed with achievement and external validation. Manson reminds us that true fulfillment comes from within, from living in alignment with our values, from making choices that reflect who we truly are.
It's like he's saying, hey, we're all just tiny specks in this vast universe. Let's not take ourselves too seriously. Let's focus on what brings us joy, what connects us to others, what makes us feel alive.
I love that. And that's the beauty of Manson's message. It's not about nihilism or giving up on life. It's about embracing the absurdity of it all, accepting our own mortality, and then using that awareness to fuel a more authentic and meaningful existence.
It's almost like a paradox.
Mhm.
By accepting our limits, we actually open ourselves up to greater freedom and possibility. We stop wasting energy on things that don't truly matter, and we can focus on what does.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a feck, I think the key takeaway for all of us is this. What are you really giving a feck about? And is it truly serving you? Take some time to reflect on that. Maybe even jot down a list of your values and priorities. And then maybe, just maybe, you'll find yourself giving a little less of a feck about the things that don't deserve your energy and a whole lot more about the things that truly light you up.
That's a great challenge to leave our listeners with. It's so easy to get caught up in the daily grind and lose sight of what truly matters. But by taking the time to reflect on our values and priorities, we can start making choices that lead to a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe by embracing the art of not giving a feck about the things that don't truly matter, we can all create a little more space for joy, connection, and purpose in our lives.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those big questions. Until next time, keep diving deep.